lactate. So I'm going to go at the big points. I'm going to put a lot of studies on it because lactate has been studied by so much. I just want to go over what I think the big things are to understand, where a lot of the mistakes are made, and what is necessary for us to understand correctly in order to be able to move forward. That being said, a lot of what I'm going to talk about is explained in many details in the studies that I'm going to post down there. So I like this setup like this because I can go, 1, 2, 3, and it allows me to do Juliens Corner's podcast on the subject one at a time. If you want me to do that on that subject, I will, obviously, it'll take a while, but I can do it. Right now, I think the studies that I'm posting can go into details better than I can, honestly. So I can make some videos to explain the big points, but I do think the overall explanation like this, plus the studies that I post for lactate anyway, are plenty. Up to you guys, so you tell me if you need more. So this one is, what is lactate, right? So lactate is the produce of something called glycolysis, right? Which takes glucose and turns into a fuel that is lactate. So that is the first point we need to make, is that lactate is a fuel and not a waste product. In the other videos, I talk about the history of lactate and everything, like how we were mistaken for a very long time about the nature of lactate. Lactate is a fuel. For example, if you look at the brain, it's the number one fuel for the brain. Glucose is not, lactate is. For muscle, it's a secondary fuel, even that one between primary and secondary we can talk. And for the heart, it is the main fuel as well. The heart can use fat as a source at certain levels, but the second things to go past a certain level is switches to lactate. So you see lactate as the fuel for anything that requires a little bit of more energy, right? It seems to be more like a kerosene type of thing. And so in glycolysis, we see certain transformation that lead to pyruvate. At that time, we thought that pyruvate was the end product of glycolysis, and depending if you were to go aerobically or anaerobically, then you would either go aerobically toward energy toward the cell, or anaerobically would turn into a waste product that is lactate. And I end up being completely wrong. For example, we can see that in the heart, lactate is produced completely into an aerobic environment. So you can look at the lactate shuttle theory. I'm going to post all this right on this, and you will see that lactate is a fuel, and not just a fuel, it is the fuel. So glycolysis, the point of glycolysis is to produce ATP, but not just that. It's also to produce a very important fuel that is lactate, right? Lactate is not just a fuel, it's also a hormone. It's called lact hormone, right? It's going to have a number of play in the body. It goes through so many details. I will refer you to that study, like the science and translation of the lactate shuttle theory, to see how far the rabbit hole goes. On top of the hormone, it's classified as an anti-inflammatory. We have seen that injection of solutions of lactate have reduced the inflammation of organs during a traumatic event. Traumatic event can be accidents. It can be, for example, sepsis, an infection that gets out of control. Lactate has been a very important anti-inflammatory in those cases. So why does it matter so much to understand that lactate is a fuel and not a waste product? But for example, let's take a brain traumatic injury, right? In that case, when you see injury to the brain, we see with something that is called hyperlactatemia, which is the lactate is being produced at a very, very high rate. Exactly like with what we call anaerobic threshold. That does not exist, right? It's the same idea. It's a protective mechanism by the body that produces a lot of lactate. But if you see lactate as a fuel, then you're going to see it as a bad thing. Because of that mistaken identity of lactate as a waste product, whenever they saw lactate raising up, they associated with morbidity, saying, oh, lactate is going to kill the person, whereas no, lactate was there because the person was injured. You see where the difference between causation and correlation is there? Is the person get injured, therefore produces lactate to heal. So they see the high level of lactate and go, that person is injured. Yes, as a measure, not as a target. And so what did they do from there? They try to lower the levels of lactate into the blood since it causes morbidity. And so instead of having the lactate that is supposed to help the body and decrease inflammation, for example, of the brain in the case of brain traumatic injuries, they diluted the lactate, therefore causing harm. So that's why it's so important to understand how the whole thing works. Lactate has also other very important qualities. For example, whenever we see what is called behavioral stress, so what does that mean? That means when you get into a fight. Behavioral stress, in that sense, is a demand of energy demanded in really modern society. That's what they mean by that. Because it doesn't mean like the bear is coming. It just means you're having an argument, right? When we see that, we see the levels of lactate raising up. Why? For two reasons. Because lactate first is a sign of the sympathetic, the excitatory levels going up, right? Which I explained in the other videos. And on top of it, it is a fuel for the brain because the brain is going to have to deal with all this. I would refer you back to the seventh hierarchy, the default mode network, that is extremely expensive energy-wise and that controls an interaction within society. So it's logical that in a fight or when we find ourselves judged or challenged by society, we have a huge expenditure of energy that requires lactate to be pumped, hence why we see the levels of lactate in the blood so high. It has to be used. It does not like to sit for many different reasons. That's what takes us here. It's very interesting is that glucose can be stored. So if you look at glycolysis, right, glycolysis, you have glucose turning into lactate. Glucose can be stored into glycogen. We see that in the muscle, but we also see that in the brain. The brain stores glucose as glycogen. That's the job of the astrocytes, right? And then from there, whenever needed, what the body likes to do is it likes to take the glycogen to turn it into glucose, to turn it into lactate. It does not like when the glycogen levels are too low, which makes sense from an evolutionary perspective, right? You don't want to only run on something that can run out at any second. So the body likes to go glucose, glycogen, then back to glucose, goes into lactate as fuel. And so what's interesting on the other side is that in order to go back to glucose, the number one substrate for that is lactate. So what you have is you have glycolysis, right, that takes glucose into lactate, and then you have lactate that goes back to glucose in a cycle like this. That's called gluconeogenesis, if you want to know what that is. And that's a cycle like that. Sometimes it's called the Cori cycle, but you see some of the gluconeogenesis that happens in the liver, but you see some of it happening in the heart, some of it happening in the brain, basically into the normal muscles, striated muscles. So you see that happening everywhere in the body. There is a deep, deep relationship between glucose, lactate, and energy production. It seems to be one of the major cycle of the body. That's why lactate matters so much. It was discarded just as a waste product, and that is a crime. Lactate is actually a very, very important thing. When you have glycolysis, for example, so glucose into lactate, right? Gluconeogenesis, lactate into glucose, those are opposite cycles. It's the same one, more or less, but going the other way. You would think those two never happen at the same time because it would make no sense, right? And actually that is not true. Those two can happen at the same time, which in that case is called a futile cycle. And when that happens, you have a massive production of ATP, which is the energy that we need, and a massive raise in temperature. That temperature can also affect how your muscle recovers. So it goes on and on and on and on like this, right? With lactate, I will post all this, but what you need to know is how important the lactate is, not as a waste product, but as a fuel, as a hormone, as an anti-inflammatory, as the main substrate for gluconeogenesis. That matters because I was explaining to people when it comes to the protocol that not carbohydrate are not the only source of energy, and they think gluconeogenesis means protein. No, it means lactate. I mean, it means fats first as a source of energy. Speaking about fat and fat burning, so that's called lipolysis. Lactate inhibits lipolysis, which is very interesting. So lipolysis is burning the fat as fuel, right? And it's inhibited by lactate. So it seems that either you choose fat as fuel or you choose lactate as fuel. But you're not going to do both outside of very, very specific things. So that becomes interesting, for example, is when we go for lactate as behavioral stress, right? Whenever we stress, whenever we feel judged, whenever we talk about anxiety, it will pump the levels of lactate very high in the blood and also stop using fat as fuel. So that will have some effect on performance, on nutrition, and all of that thing. So lactate matters a lot, and this is why we're doing this class, right? So the entire thing is about anxiety as an angle, but I believe it's very important to understand the importance of lactate and to stop the mistakes we have made so far in mistaking its identity and understand that it is actually not Clark Kent, but rather Superman. Okay. Thank you, guys.